been a relatively healthy adult. I get my annual physical, any test, blood work, everything is always within range. So I expected that trend to continue when I went to the eye doctor in April. I had been experiencing some blurred vision in my right eye. I explained the symptoms to my doctor, and he says, oh, it's probably something that normally happens in the retina in people over 50, and it should resolve on its own. So he conducts a thorough exam, and then we go into the room to look at the image of my right eye. So we both look at the screen, and he says, I wasn't expecting to see that. And I smile and perk up. I said, well, what are we looking at? And what's the fix? And he said, you've had a vascular event in your right eye. And I'm going to go send all of your results over to the retinal specialist, and they will probably want to see you this afternoon. And I said, well, I can't go this afternoon. You know, I'm only here on lunch. I have to go back to work. And he says no and nods his head no as well, I guess to emphasize it. And he says, you've had a vascular event in your eye. That means you could have a vascular event in another part of your body, like your brain. And then he turns to leave to send my results. Of course. And I sit there and I was like, wait, hold on. Wait, he's saying I could have a stroke. That's what he's saying to me. And how could that be? I mean, I work out vigorously 5 days a week. I eat clean 85% of the time. I take my blood pressure medication every day. I check my blood pressure every day, and it's always fine. I'm like, how could this be happening to me? So he comes back in, he says, you know what, they said that it's not an emergency, but they are going to call you and schedule an appointment to see you within the next week. So I leave, and that evening I go home, and I do what we all do when we have a medical issue that we're not sure about. I could not resist the temptation of going online to truly terrify myself. So I read about people going to sleep and having eye strokes and waking up blind. I read that while it almost always only happens in one eye, it doesn't mean that it won't happen in the other eye. And that night I barely slept because I kept waking up to open my eyes to make sure I could still see. So I have my appointment with the retinal specialist. They had a nurse who did all of the testing, and she starts out with a vision test. And she does my left eye, and I pass with flying colors, everything perfect. And then she does my right eye, and I can't make out the letters on the screen. And she makes them larger and larger, and I still can't quite make them out. And then she stands a foot in front of me and holds up her hand and says, how many fingers do I have up? And she looked panicked. I'm panicked. She goes to jot down my results. And she says, your vision in your right eye has gotten a lot worse since your doctor appointment. You were 20/30 that day, and now you're 20/100. And I start crying because it was just so frightening to me that in such a short span of time, the vision could have gotten that much worse. And she consoles me. She says, don't worry, sweetie, they're going to fix you right up. And I say, thank you. And I say, well, from your lips to God's ears. The specialist comes into the examination room. He introduces himself, and then he says, something bad happened. And no. And so So he goes on to explain that what happened in my right eye is central retinal vein occlusion, CRVO for short, and it's when a clot forms in the main vein in the eye, so the blood cannot flow back to the heart, and then it ends up seeping into the retina, and it causes inflammation. The inflammation is what caused the blurred vision. He tells me that the treatment is a series of 3 injections in the affected eye. And so I asked him, how did this happen? Why did this happen? He said typically it happens in people who are over 50 but have uncontrolled diabetes or blood pressure. And I said, well, that's not me. I have high blood pressure, but it's controlled, medication, exercise, and all the things. He says, yeah, well, it still can happen. And then I asked him if I am at a risk of having a stroke. He says, no, that would only be if the blockage were in the main artery. So there is no risk of stroke. So I've been relieved at knowing that. And then he tells me that my depth perception will be off. And so that when I'm driving, I have to be more careful. I have to leave more space between myself and other cars than usual. He said that I have to be especially careful with changing lanes because the objects may in fact appear smaller than they actually are. And so I go home that evening and I say, well, you know what, look, the diagnosis isn't ideal, but it could be much worse. And I feel, I need to be grateful for that. I need to stay in gratitude. But my self-talk does not work. And I felt broken. And I felt terrorized by the idea, though highly unlikely, that it would happen in the other eye, which would mean that I couldn't drive, which would mean that I'd be robbed of my independence. And I live in that state for a few days, and then it finally clicks for me. I said, you know what? You're not new to this, you're true to this. You've encountered difficulties before. And the key to overcoming a challenge is first believing that you can overcome that challenge. And I decide to not allow myself to be pulled into the temptation to fall into despair, to feel sorry for myself, to feel beaten before I even begin to fight. And in that moment, I say no firmly to temptation, and I say yes to me and my well-being. Thank you.